Spain has denied US claims that Madrid has agreed to cooperate with the US military. President Trump had threatened to cut off trade links after Spain refused to allow the United States to use its airbases to attack Iran. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt told reporters Spain has now backed down.
With respect to Spain, I think they heard the president's message yesterday loud and clear. And it's my understanding over the past several hours they've agreed to cooperate with the U.S. military. And so I know that the U.S. military is coordinating with their counterparts in Spain. But the president expects all of our European allies, of course, to cooperate in this long sought after mission, not just for the United States, but also for Europe, to crush the rogue Iranian regime that, again, not only threatens America, but also threatens our European allies as well.
Responding to those comments, Spain's foreign minister told a Spanish radio station that the country's position on the war and the use of its military bases had not changed. Here's how this row unfolded.
Spain's prime minister was unequivocal.
En definitiva,
the position of the Spanish government can be summed up in 4 words: no to the war.
no a la guerra.
Pedro Sanchez had refused to allow the US to use Spain's air bases, warning that Europe should not be dragged into a conflict that would only fuel economic instability. The rift widened when a characteristically outspoken President Trump, meeting Germany's Chancellor, made this announcement.
Spain has been terrible. We're going to cut off all trade with Spain. We don't want anything to do with Spain.
Trump was angered not only by Spain's lack of support, but also its failure to commit to boosting defence spending. Another Spanish ally stood up for Sanchez. The French President Emmanuel Macron expressed his solidarity against so-called economic coercion. Spain's financial markets were largely unperturbed, viewing Trump's remarks as an empty threat. Pedro Sanchez was the first European leader to take a clear stand against Donald Trump's war in Iran, but that is now in doubt.
Let's get more on this from Morillas, who's director of the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs. Welcome to DW. So, what do you make of this row between Washington and Madrid and this dispute over facts? Is Spain cooperating or not?
Well, Spain cooperated up until the invasion and the intervention in Iran. What Spain's government has said is that it will no longer cooperate in case there are requests for these bases to be used again. Those bases are under Spanish sovereignty, and there's an agreement between the US and Spain to use them on mutual terms. And this is what Spain is not cooperating, basically because this resonates quite well with not only the position of Spain as a government, but also civil society in the country.
And what therefore do you make of these White House statements, which seem to be less than true?
Well, to be honest, maybe they are referring to the fact that there are also other fronts on which the relationship with Spain happens. It's not only a question of the use of those military bases as assets of this bilateral relationship. There's also a question related to trade, question related to investment, and so on and so forth. So maybe what they are referring to is about this broader connection between Spain and the United States, which in general is still okay, despite the disagreement on not only Iran, but also other issues on foreign policy or even internal politics.
OK, looking at the broader issues, we have President Trump threatening to cut trade ties with Spain over that refusal. Can this happen that simply?
Not really. Spain has found alignment within other European Union member states, but also Brussels in general, over the idea that an attack on threatening on trade issues to a member of the single market can be considered a question that affects the whole of the single market. So there has been on this issue particularly quite a lot of support for Spain's position and against the use of commercial threats by the United States. Other things are related to foreign policy, security and defense, which remain issues of national competence, and of course where the European Union member states are quite divided over the war in Iran at this moment.
But so on trade, the US can't just say to Spain, right, that's it, we're cutting ties, because this is something that the European Union as a bloc actually deals with. So what do we make of that statement from President Trump? Is that just bluster, or is this a president who hasn't grasped the details, or should Brussels now be gearing up for a big fight with Washington over this?
Well, the president of the United States is not really up for details when it comes to the relationship with other states around the world. But the truth is that the European Union, even during the Greenland crisis, reacted quite united on the commercial, on the trade front. And this responds to the only tool at the European Union's disposal, which is its single market and the common commercial policy, to remain united on things against not only the United States, but also China or other countries. So probably what the United States could do is target specific products that come from Spain, trying to alter the commercial ties. But Spain is not very exposed to when it comes to exports to the US market. Other member states are much more exposed than Spain is.
The European Union has gone through quite a fractious time over the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. We see blocs emerging and splits emerging. Can you sum up for us the view of this latest war, the United States and Israel against Iran? Sum up for us the view of this war across EU states.
Well, it's very different. I mean, the European Union has been very united on the Ukraine front, for instance. Even Spain, being a faraway country from Ukraine, has provided a lot of support to the common European Union's position for defending Ukraine. And what basically Spain is arguing at this point is that there's no difference between the Ukraine crisis, the Gaza crisis, and the Iran crisis when it comes to the respect for international law. That means that the use of force, threatening other countries and interfering militarily into other countries has no legal basis. And what is the case for Russia in Ukraine, it also has to do with Israel's policy towards and war towards Gaza, not having full respect for international law, for international humanitarian law. And now for Iran, is basically the same principle, is this has not been a lawful intervention when it comes to the UN Security Council pronouncing itself on this, or even the American Congress or Senate, who have not had a say on this war either.
Spain's foreign minister has criticised the German chancellor for staying silent while Donald Trump was trashing Spain in front of him in the White House yesterday. How unusual is it to see this open hostility between EU partners?
Well, the worst for these hostilities among EU partners is the unity of the European Union as such. And I think that that's what's important to be secured, at least in the areas where the European Union has a strong and common position, that is most particularly trade. But I think that even the Chancellor of Germany has also initially his remarks at the White House have been nuanced later when it comes to defending also the integrity of the single market and supporting those countries that are threatened by tariffs, specific tariffs by the White House. So I think that the European Union, I insist, on this front, not on security, not on foreign policy, not on defense, is not showing very united, but on this front, the trade front is it stands quite united, and even the president of the European Council, Antonio Costa, has said so.
Quick word about Ukraine. There must be a worry in Europe that this latest American-led adventure will cost Ukraine, and politically and materially. Will Trump lose interest in Ukraine, and can US arms manufacturers supply two wars at the same time?
Well, these are two different aspects. One is the strategic one. Another one is the capabilities question regarding the European Union's defense industry and the capacity to provide to Ukraine what the US is not providing. And what we are seeing on this last front is that the EU has actually, EU countries, European countries, also the United Kingdom, have replaced quite a lot of what the US used to give to Ukraine, because the problem is, as I said, strategically speaking, there's no clear answer on where the US stands vis-a-vis the future of the war. Sometimes we get the impression that getting along with Putin on equal terms and thus throwing Ukraine under the bus is something that is present in the White House thinking. And then we get other news when it comes to still keeping good prospects for negotiations for Ukraine. So I think that the European Union has to do its effort to support Ukraine while the US is hesitant on doing so.
Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. Paul Morillas from the Barcelona Center for International Affairs.
Thanks for having me. A pleasure.
Let's get more from our correspondent, Teri Schultz in Brussels. Welcome, Teri. How are other European leaders reacting to this apparent rift between Donald Trump and EU member state Spain?
Well, it took a few hours, Phil, but today European Council President Antonio Costa said that he comes out fully in favor of European solidarity with the Spanish leader. And later in the afternoon, we also saw that French President Emmanuel Macron said that he had spoken with Pedro Sanchez and expressed his support. So, you know, they're treading a fine line, just like with the EU position on the Israeli and U.S. strikes on Iran. They don't want to come out and look like they're openly opposing the United States. But of course, they can't let President Trump sit in the White House and completely trash their fellow leaders either. So again, you know, it's not the same as when you're sitting right there next to President Trump, but many of them have come out and said that they stand with Prime Minister Sanchez on the rule of law, on respect for international order, but not going so far as to say that they oppose the actions in Iran.
OK, so President Trump now says he's going to cut off trade ties with Spain. Spain, of course, a member of the European Union, which is likely to bring Washington into conflict with Brussels. Just talk us through what is likely to happen and how Brussels is likely to respond.
That's right. It's not as easy as President Trump and his team seem to think, because trade policy with European Union countries is handled at the EU level. So you can't simply pick off countries and, you know, attack some bilateral deals that you have with them. There may be smaller arrangements like that. But for the majority of trade between Spain and the United States, this is handled as part of EU-US trade. Now, that is in trouble at the moment. The US-EU trade deal that was negotiated last year is currently on hold because of Donald Trump's recent threats to impose tariffs again on the European Union. So that is already a big mess. But even though he told his staff to look into how that they can punish Spain for its approach on this, he won't be able to completely cut off any trade between the U.S. and Spain.
OK, and going back to the European solidarity that you were talking about, we have the Spanish foreign minister accusing the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, of failing to demonstrate solidarity with Madrid because he said nothing when President Trump was criticising Spain in the Oval Office while Chancellor Merz was sat right there. Chancellor Merz said he wanted to avoid tension with the American president by not contradicting him. So what's going on here? Do you see this as a real row between Spain and Germany, or is this just political posturing?
Well, I think Spain is surely disappointed that Merz didn't speak up for him, but everybody has in their mind flashbacks to what happened to Ukrainian President Zelensky when he stood up for his own country and defended himself. You know, you had this full-on attack from the U.S. cabinet against him, and nobody would want that to happen to Chancellor Merz either. You know, I think it's fair to say that he could have said a bit more instead of saying, yeah, we do want Spain to spend more of its GDP on defense. But at the same time, it doesn't really help anyone for there to be a clash between the EU's largest economy, the leader of the EU's largest economy, Germany, and President Trump. There were more statements coming out today. For example, by the industrial strategy commissioner was asked in a press conference about something else, and he said that the United States should understand that if it is is going to attack one member, it does bring it to the EU level. And he said, remember Greenland. And the EU did stand up quite strongly against threats to take Greenland, and even brought in its, trade bazooka as a threat against the United States. So, I mean, we're not there yet, but I guess it's not inconceivable that things could rise to that level again.
Quick word about NATO, Teri. Spain and the US, obviously NATO countries. Is that Spanish refusal to allow US bases in Spain to be used to attack Iran, is that going to cause tension in the alliance?
We haven't seen that yet. Again, what happened was that Spain said the U.S. could not use the two jointly operated bases for any offensive attacks on Iran. And so the U.S. basically moved more than a dozen planes to Germany, which has allowed the United States to basically do what it wants, as far as we can tell, with the German bases. So they moved to Ramstein. Again, we don't know exactly what the U.S. is going to do out of European bases, what other rights it may be asking from European countries. We know that there was conflict with Keir Starmer about this, and that Starmer reversed his position and did allow the U.S. to use those bases. Now, the Europeans are saying most of the time that they want this to be used only defensively and not for offensive attacks. But again, we're in early days of this war, and if the U.S. administration is to be believed, we could be headed for weeks more conflict, and a lot of things will change. So at the moment, we have not seen tensions rise up in the alliance. Now, another thing happened today, Phil, that could change things, and that is that NATO intercepted a missile headed toward Turkey, a NATO ally. And so if Iran does indeed start targeting NATO countries, we could see a lot of changes in the NATO approach to this, which has, for the most part now, just been to wait it out quietly.
Thanks for that, Teri. Teri Schultz in Brussels. Well, let's get more on the Spanish position from Alana Moceri. She's a professor of international relations at the IE School of Politics, Economics and Global Affairs in Madrid. Welcome to DW. Why has Spain taken such a clear position against these strikes on Iran when so many other European countries have been much more cautious, much more equivocal?
Yeah, well, and Spain is a country that a great majority of the citizens are very much anti-Trump. That gives PM Pedro Sanchez a lot of room there, actually a lot of incentive to take that position. Of course, he comes from the Socialist Party, a left-leaning party, and so also within his coalition is extremely anti-Trump. And so that really helps, right? 8 in 10 Spaniards believe that Trump is a danger to the world. And so definitely, it makes political sense internally, and it also matches up, with Pedro Sanchez's politics and his coalition's politics, which is a very anti-war stance, and also supporting the rule of law internationally. And those are two things that Sanchez has been very outspoken about, and things that his political party, and in fact his whole coalition, has been very staunch about for many years. So in that sense, it's not terribly surprising. He just happens to be in the context of Europeans that don't want to ever disturb Trump in any way.
OK, so that's that. But let me just bring you some news that's reached us in the last hour or so. Let me read you what the White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt has been saying. She says, I think they heard the president's message. She's talking about Spain. I think they heard the president's message yesterday loud and clear. It is my understanding, she says, that over the past several hours, they, the Spanish, have agreed to cooperate with the US military. What do you make of those sketchy details?
Yeah, well, the Spanish government has already come out and refuted that and said there has been no conversation and no agreement. So it is a little bit strange. And here you've got an American and Spanish citizen. It's a bit strange to hear the White House coming out with a statement like that when it's clearly not true. There's been no conversation, and Spain immediately reacted with their own statement saying this just isn't true. I think I would only imagine because they really want, they want use of these bases. The base at Rota and the base at Morón are strategically important air bases in Spain, and so perhaps they're hoping that they can bully Spain in some other way, because clearly this threat of cutting off trade hasn't really worked so well.
And why would they want to do that? Because my understanding is that the United States has moved their jets from those Spanish air bases to Ramstein here in Germany. So why is that even still a thing?
It's always hard to know with this White House. I say as an analyst, it's really hard to explain things because things just come out of left field, and so there's not a lot of strategy behind anything that Trump's doing. I mean, his foreign policy changes from day to day, and so he ran as the peace president, and now he's apparently a war president, and so that a statement like this comes out of the Trump White House. I guess I could say it's not terribly surprising, but it's mystifying because it's just not true.
Right. Okay. So Pedro Sanchez gets to walk his walk as well as talk his talk, which is fine for Spain, because Spain is far from the potential firing line that would be Russia if things get weird. I'll explain what this has to do with Iran. Because the criticism of Spain's position militarily, not just on Iran, but also on increasing its NATO contributions, has been from countries like Poland and the Baltics. The farther you are away geographically from Russia, the less inclined those countries are to take military threats seriously. Does that sort of fit this particular scenario?
Well, perhaps if you're just talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine, but Spain is a lot closer to the Middle East, and also, I mean, the real reason for Spain, you have to also notice it. Look at the context of this. So Spain is a country that is, as a whole, in public opinion, does not want to see more defense spending. It is a very difficult sell for any prime minister. Whether they're on the right or the left, it's a difficult sell. So Spain was hovering under 1% of its GDP in defense spending for many, many years. It raised that to 1.3% last year, and it's now pledging to get to the 2% mark, which is a big deal for a country like Spain that, again, it's so unpopular publicly. Now, this jump to 5% is a pretty radical jump for any country in Europe, and no one's quite there. But to expect Spain to get there when it's already doing a pretty heavy lift getting to 2, I think is a little bit, out of the question. But, Spain's trying to get there.
Let's end with a question about Spain and Germany, because we have the Spanish foreign minister criticising Friedrich Merz, the chancellor, for failing to show solidarity with Spain when Donald Trump was criticising Madrid, with Chancellor Merz sat right next to him. There have also been other differences between Berlin and Madrid, not just on NATO, but on Middle East policy as well. Just tell us more about the relationship between Berlin and Madrid.
Well, yeah. I mean, it seems that most of the friction comes from the trying to get to this goal, this NATO goal, this spending on defense, but also, and sitting there next to Trump. I get it. We've all seen these White House scenes where everybody, Trump and his posse, jump on whoever's there, and so I can understand quite well why Merz might have been reluctant to get into a fight with these guys right there on live television. But yeah, I mean, I think it is from Stan's standpoint, it's an easy thing to criticize from the government. I mean, they've got their own opposition internally as well, and so the right, they hate anything Sanchez does, even if a lot of those people hate Trump.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Alana Moceri from the IE University in Madrid. Thank you.
Thank you.